The great river that had fed, guided, and protected countless generations spoke differently that morning, its voice carrying an unfamiliar urgency that made even the oldest grandmother pause at her dawn prayers. Where the water normally flowed with the steady rhythm of a sleeping giant's breath, it now rushed with the restless energy of something awakening, something changing, carrying strange debris from upstream territories no living person had ever seen, and making sounds that belonged to no season these people had ever known. If you want another story from the world of 1491, stay with this fire. There's more coming. The sun's first light revealed what the darkness had hidden, watermarks along the familiar stone outcropping that stood 3 hands higher than anyone remembered from the longest floods of their grandparents' time, staining the rock with colors that spoke of waters carrying soil from unknown territories upstream. Small cooking fires dotted the riverbank settlement like fallen stars, their smoke rising straight in the still air, while families began their daily communion with the waters that governed every aspect of their existence, the familiar ritual of morning prayer now carrying undertones of uncertainty as voices that normally rang with confident gratitude found themselves asking questions instead of offering praise. The river's sound had changed during the night hours, its voice now carrying harmonics that spoke of power building somewhere far beyond their ability to see or influence, transforming the gentle murmur they had used as a lullaby into something that demanded attention and made sleep difficult. Children who had learned to read the river's moods before they could properly weave grass mats pointed at birds behaving strangely, waterfowl that normally fed in the shallows now keeping to deeper currents, their calls sharp with anxiety that needed no translation. The scent of the morning air carried troubling information. The usual mixture of wood smoke, river mist, and green plants now included traces of decay and disruption, the smell of things torn from their proper places and carried far from where they belonged. Dew that normally sparkled with clarity now carried a slight muddiness that spoke of particles suspended in air that had traveled from territories where different rules applied. The river had always been more than water to these people: counselor, provider, highway, and sometimes judge, its moods and behaviors woven so deeply into their understanding of how life should be lived that their language contained dozens of words for different types of water movement, each carrying instructions for human response tested through generations of careful observation. Every morning brought the checking of fish weirs woven from split willow and cattail fiber, the careful inspection of nets that had soaked overnight, and the launch of elm bark canoes that would carry hunters and traders to distant bends, where other families maintained their own intimate relationships with the flowing giant. Today, however, the familiar rhythm felt different, charged with energy that made experienced river readers exchange glances heavy with unspoken concern, their hands moving automatically through tasks while their minds processed information that didn't fit established patterns. The texture of morning light seemed different as it reflected off water moving with unprecedented speed, creating brightness patterns that had no place in their accumulated visual memory, patterns that spoke of depth and current behavior that challenged fundamental assumptions about this waterway that had shaped their culture's understanding of proper relationship between human need and natural abundance. Women knelt by the water's edge to fill clay vessels marked with generations of careful craftsmanship, their practiced movements automatic even as their eyes registered troubling signs that made their hands pause mid-motion. The usual places where children safely played in the shallows now swirled with unexpected currents that moved with purposeful energy, currents that spoke of pressures building upstream, of natural forces gathering momentum that transformed familiar landscape into something requiring new strategies for safe interaction. The gentle lapping that normally announced the river's peaceful mood had been replaced by an urgent whisper that seemed to carry warnings from territories far beyond their knowledge, warnings that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to survival instincts that remembered when life depended on reading subtle changes in natural systems. Reed mats laid out for drying moved more than they should in the morning breeze, as if the earth itself had grown restless beneath them. The first canoe of the day pushed away from the landing with unusual caution, its paddlers testing the current's strength before committing to the crossing that had been routine for countless seasons, their paddle strokes creating sounds that seemed unnaturally sharp against the river's new voice. The river's voice changed pitch as the vessel moved from shallow to deep water, the familiar scrape of paddle against water now accompanied by subtle vibrations that traveled through the hull into bodies of men who had known this river since childhood, vibrations that spoke of power building beneath the surface, power that transformed what should have been a straightforward journey into an exercise in constant vigilance. The canoe's elm bark hull, shaped with techniques passed down through generations, responded normally to human guidance, but moved through water that followed no familiar rules, water that seemed to pull the vessel in directions that had nothing to do with paddle placement, directions that required constant correction and turned routine travel into exhausting work that demanded complete attention. The familiar landmarks that guided navigation remained in their expected places but appeared different when viewed from water that reflected light in unfamiliar patterns and created visual distortions that made distance judgment difficult. At the morning landing, where 3 separate family groups regularly gathered to share news and trade surplus goods, conversations carried an undertone of shared unease that transformed usual cheerful exchanges into careful discussion of observations that didn't fit established patterns. Clay vessels filled with processed maple sugar, bundles of cattail root flour, and carefully prepared fish were exchanged with usual courtesy, but hands lingered longer over familiar gestures, and eyes kept returning to water that flowed past their gathering place with unprecedented speed, carrying debris that spoke of destruction happening somewhere upstream. The grandmother who kept the winter count, her memory holding decades of seasonal patterns encoded in the grandmother who kept the winter memory, painted on hide with simple marks only she could read that preserved the community's accumulated wisdom, stood for long moments studying the current's behavior with intense concentration. Her weathered hands worked automatically at repair of fishing cordage while her mind processed information that didn't fit any known template, information that challenged patterns established through careful observation over generations. Cordage made from twisted basswood fiber, prepared through processes requiring timing and skill accumulated over lifetimes of practice, cracked under tension that should have been well within its tested limits, forcing emergency repairs with precious materials meant for other purposes. The sound of stone scrapers preparing fish hides for smoking mixed with the increasingly urgent whisper of water moving faster than anyone had witnessed, creating a symphony of familiar activities conducted against an increasingly unfamiliar background. Clay pots shaped from riverbank earth and fired with techniques refined through countless generations knocked together more frequently as the ground seemed less stable, their distinctive sounds joining the growing chorus of signs that something fundamental had shifted in the relationship between land and water, between human intention and natural force. The pots themselves, marked with designs that told stories of their makers' families, represented not just functional tools, but connections to ancestors whose wisdom lived on in clay forms that served daily needs while maintaining spiritual connections to earth that provided raw materials and techniques that transformed simple mud into vessels essential for preserving human culture through times of change and challenge. When the sun reached its highest point, casting shadows that should have provided reliable indicators of time and season, the stone markers that had guided generations of river travelers for measuring water levels had vanished entirely beneath the rising flow, leaving experienced navigators to depend on memory and intuition rather than the reliable landmarks their fathers and grandfathers had used to predict the river's behavior. With accuracy that had sustained successful fishing, travel, and trade networks extending far beyond their immediate territory into relationships with distant communities, whose survival also depended on the predictable patterns that normally govern this massive waterway's seasonal rhythms and daily variations. The disappearance of these markers, carved and positioned by ancestors whose understanding of river behavior had been tested through seasons of abundance and scarcity, represented not just the loss of navigational aids, but the erosion of accumulated wisdom that connected current generations to knowledge systems that had preserved human life and cultural continuity through changes and challenges that existed now only in ceremonial songs and sacred stories. The bank, where children normally gathered reeds for mat weaving, their small hands learning through patient practice to select plants at precisely the right stage of growth and to harvest them with techniques that ensured continued abundance for future seasons, had begun to soften and slump under pressure from water that pressed against earth with force that exceeded anything in the community's collective memory, sending small cascades of rich soil into the rushing current that swallowed them without trace, each collapse accompanied by sounds like distant thunder that spoke of forces beyond human control or understanding, forces that operated according to scales of power and time that made human planning and individual will seem as insignificant as single raindrops in a storm that had already begun to reshape the fundamental geography upon which their entire way of life depended for physical survival and cultural coherence. Animals that had shared this riverside territory for countless generations, their own survival strategies refined through evolutionary processes that had taught them to read subtle environmental changes with precision that often exceeded human perception, began moving to higher ground with the purposeful urgency of creatures responding to information unavailable to human senses, but unmistakable in its implications for immediate safety and long-term survival. Their departure created an eerie quiet that made every human voice sound unnaturally loud against the river's growing roar, a roar that seemed to come not just from the water itself, but from the interaction between moving liquid and landscape that was being transformed by pressures that had been building somewhere far upstream, pressures that arrived at their location without warning or opportunity for preparation, through the careful planning and resource management that normally allowed human communities to adapt to environmental changes through gradual adjustment, rather than emergency response to conditions that allowed no time for deliberation or consensus building. Paths that had been worn smooth by generations of daily travel, their surfaces polished by countless footsteps into routes that represented the most efficient connections between essential resources, dwelling places, and seasonal activity areas, disappeared beneath the expanding water with a finality that spoke not just of temporary inconvenience, but of fundamental disruption, to movement patterns that had organized daily life and seasonal cycles for longer than anyone could remember, forcing families to choose between higher routes that would require routes that would add half a day of walking of additional travel through terrain that offered no guarantee of safety or reliable navigation, and dangerous attempts to cross at points where the current now moved with terrifying speed and power that transformed familiar water into a landscape as alien and threatening as any they might encounter in territories completely unknown to human experience or traditional knowledge systems. The fishing weirs that represented weeks of careful construction and positioning, their willow and basswood framework designed and built according to principles that had been refined through generations of experimentation and observation, began showing signs of stress under pressure from debris being carried down from upstream territories, broken branches, uprooted bushes, and stranger things that spoke of devastation happening somewhere beyond their knowledge or ability to influence. Devastation that sent messages floating past their traditional fishing stations, like reports from a war being fought in territories they had never seen by forces they could not identify or understand through any framework provided by their cultural traditions or accumulated experience with natural phenomena that normally provided clear signals about appropriate human responses to environmental change and seasonal variation. Elders who had lived through floods, droughts, and storms that existed only in the oldest songs, their memories holding decades of experience with challenges that had tested their community's survival skills and adaptive capacity, found themselves facing conditions that had no place in their accumulated wisdom, forcing them into debates about risks and responses that had no precedent in their careful oral traditions that had preserved not just information about past events, but frameworks for understanding how natural forces operated and how human communities could maintain their essential functions even during times of environmental stress that pushed survival skills and social cooperation to their functional limits. The usual midday pause for food and rest became an urgent council session as family leaders gathered around a hastily built fire to share observations and attempt interpretations of signs that seemed to point toward changes too large and too immediate for normal human planning, changes that demanded decision-making processes that could function without the careful deliberation and community consensus that normally guided responses to challenges that tested collective survival and individual courage. The taste of smoke mixed with the increasingly humid air created an atmosphere of barely controlled urgency that transformed familiar gathering procedures into emergency consultations, where every voice carried weight that normal circumstances would have distributed differently according to age, experience, and specialized knowledge, while hands that normally shaped clay or wove fibers into useful forms now gestured toward water that seemed determined to rewrite the fundamental geography of their lives according to rules that recognized no human authority and respected no boundaries between territories that had seemed permanently protected from the river's influence and areas that had always been understood to belong more to water than to land, more to seasonal variation than to human control, more to forces larger than community planning, than to the careful stewardship that had sustained their way of life through countless generations of respectful cooperation with natural systems that had seemed as reliable as sunrise and as predictable as the return of migrating birds to familiar nesting territories along waterways that had flowed through landscapes that appeared permanent but were now revealing their essential fluidity in ways that challenged every assumption about the nature of home, territory, safety, and the proper relationship between human intention and natural law. Without warning, a section of riverbank that had supported generations of dwellings simply gave way, sliding into the torrent with a sound like breaking thunder that sent families scrambling to save what they could from homes that had seemed permanently rooted in reliable earth, their familiar living spaces transformed into debris floating downstream with the same helpless momentum as the broken branches and uprooted plants that had been arriving all morning from unknown territories upstream, where similar destruction was apparently reshaping landscapes and displacing lives according to forces that recognized no human authority over spaces that had been considered permanently settled and reliably secure against natural disruption. The river's voice rose to a roar that drowned out human speech, forcing communication through gestures and shared understanding as people who had lived their entire lives in harmony with this waterway suddenly found themselves refugees from its unprecedented power and unpredictable hunger, for territory that had always been considered safely beyond its reach, territory that contained not just individual homes but the accumulated work of generations embedded in gardens, storage areas, ceremonial spaces, and the thousand improvements that transformed wild landscape into humanized space where families could raise children and preserve the knowledge systems that sustained cultural continuity through seasonal cycles and generational change. Canoes that had been beached in what were considered secure locations now floated free, their painted hulls bobbing like leaves in a current that seemed determined to claim everything within its expanding grasp, forcing desperate retrieval efforts that required skill, courage, and luck in equal measure as experienced boaters pushed their abilities to dangerous limits in attempts to recover vessels that represented not just transportation, but essential tools for survival in territory where water served as the primary highway connecting scattered family groups and providing access to resources that existed only at specific locations along the waterway's extended network of main channels, tributaries, and backwater areas where fishing, hunting, and plant-gathering activities had been carefully distributed to maximize abundance while maintaining sustainable relationships with natural systems. The smoking racks where families preserved their winter food supplies stood in immediate danger as the river's expansion reached toward carefully constructed frameworks that held the difference between comfortable survival and starvation during the harsh months ahead, forcing impossible choices between risking lives to save irreplaceable resources and accepting losses that would reshape the fundamental security of everyone who depended on those stores to maintain adequate nutrition through seasons when fishing became difficult and plant foods disappeared beneath snow that could last until the return of spring weather that allowed resumption of normal food acquisition activities. Emergency became the new normal, as families who had maintained their individual territories and responsibilities for generations suddenly found themselves dependent on cooperative efforts that required instant trust and shared risk, their usual social patterns abandoned in favor of whatever strategies might preserve life and essential resources against forces that showed no respect for human boundaries or traditional arrangements for managing resources, territory, and social relationships. As shadows lengthened toward evening, the hastily convened council fire brought together voices that had never before needed to make decisions of such magnitude and urgency, their familiar patterns of discussion and consensus building challenged by circumstances that demanded immediate action without the luxury of extensive deliberation that normally characterized community decision-making processes. The grandmother who held the winter count sat with the emergency talking stick, her weathered hands steady despite the chaos surrounding their gathering place, her voice calm and clear as she spoke words that would determine whether families would attempt to stay and fight the river's expansion or begin the heartbreaking process of abandoning homes and territories that held the accumulated work and memories of countless generations, who had shaped this landscape according to principles of sustainability and respectful cooperation with natural systems. Smoke from the council fire rose straight into the evening air, carrying prayers and decisions toward sky that had witnessed similar gatherings throughout the long history of human life along this waterway, but never one faced with changes that happened so quickly that wisdom accumulated over generations seemed inadequate to provide guidance for choices that could not be delayed or reconsidered through the careful deliberation that normally ensured decisions reflected collective wisdom rather than individual fear or hasty judgment based on incomplete information about conditions that extended far beyond their ability to observe or influence through traditional methods of environmental monitoring and community consultation. The decision emerged through the ancient process of patient listening and gradual consensus, shaped by recognition that the river's new behavior might be temporary, but could also represent a fundamental shift that required adaptive responses no living person had ever been forced to contemplate, responses that would test not just their practical survival skills but their cultural capacity to maintain essential community functions while adapting to environmental conditions that challenged basic assumptions about proper relationship between human planning and natural forces that had seemed predictable enough to support long-term thinking and intergenerational resource management strategies. Runners would carry warning messages to related families living at distant bends and tributaries, their knowledge of alternative paths and emergency signals suddenly critical for the survival of people they might never see again, but who shared the common vulnerability of all who had built their lives around the assumption that this river would continue behaving within the limits their ancestors had learned to respect and anticipate through careful observation and respectful adaptation to seasonal patterns that had sustained human life along this waterway for longer than anyone could remember or calculate using the traditional methods of timekeeping that connected present generations to ancestral knowledge and future responsibilities. Darkness brought a deceptive quiet as the river continued its relentless expansion, its voice now so constant that it became a backdrop against which other sounds, the crack of burning wood, the rustle of emergency shelters being constructed from salvaged materials, the soft conversations of families making plans that no one could be certain would remain relevant by morning, took on an intensity that made every word and gesture feel weighted with significance that normal times never demanded, significance that transformed ordinary human activities into ceremonies of persistence and hope that acknowledged both the fragility of human planning and the strength of human determination to adapt and survive regardless of circumstances beyond individual or community control. Watch rotation divided the night into periods of responsibility shared among people whose usual roles and relationships had been transformed by circumstances that made everyone equal in their uncertainty and mutual dependence, their normal social hierarchy temporarily replaced by simple recognition of who could best serve the community's immediate needs for vigilance, decision-making, and emotional steadiness during hours that tested their individual and collective capacity to maintain hope and determination in the face of changes that challenged every assumption about the nature of home, security, and proper relationship between human intention and natural forces that operated according to scales of time and power that made human life seem both precious and temporary. Smoking racks rebuilt in hasty new locations processed fish that might be the last harvest from familiar waters for longer than anyone wanted to contemplate, their familiar smell mingling with the scent of wet earth and broken vegetation to create an atmosphere that spoke simultaneously of continuity and loss, of human persistence in the face of overwhelming natural forces, and of the fragile nature of all human arrangements when confronted with powers that recognized no boundaries between wild and domesticated, natural and human, permanent and temporary arrangements that had seemed as reliable as sunrise, but now revealed their essential dependence on conditions that could change without warning or opportunity for preparation. Reed mats woven from materials saved from flooded storage areas provided inadequate insulation against ground that remained saturated from the river's unprecedented expansion. But they represented the continuation of skills and traditions that would need to be preserved and adapted regardless of how dramatically their physical circumstances might change in the days and seasons ahead. Skills that connected them to ancestors who had faced their own challenges and found ways to maintain essential human functions even when environmental conditions tested survival capacities to their limits and beyond, into territory where success depended on courage, wisdom, and cooperation, rather than individual strength or accumulated resources. As the moon rose through clouds that reflected the river's new voice back toward Earth, families settled into sleep patterns interrupted by the necessity of periodic checking on water levels and emergency preparations, their dreams mixing with the sound of flowing water that had become simultaneously lullaby and warning, familiar presence and unpredictable threat, reminder of their complete dependence on forces larger than human understanding, and of their remarkable capacity to adapt and survive even when everything they had considered permanent proved temporary. The great river continued its ancient work of shaping the land and the people who lived beside it, demonstrating once again that it remained the ultimate authority in this relationship, the force that gave life and took it away, that connected distant territories and separated familiar ones, demanding constant respect, while offering no guarantees beyond the certainty that its voice would continue long after human voices had been forgotten.